So before I really get started, I should probably explain. I've dropped it a few times in community posts, and I might have mentioned it in the live streams. But originally for Fate Week, my video contribution was supposed to be not this. Instead, it was supposed to be a review of the Fate Stay Night visual novel, the scope of which kept growing and then it shrunk. Maybe I'll post justification as to why it's not this at some point. But the long and the short of it is, the emulator I was using to read it crashed mid read of the visual novel and broke. Like, I physically couldn't use it anymore. And that didn't happen to me once, because I tried it again and it happened to me a second time. I could switch to another emulator, but the devices I do own don't seem to support most of the common emulators people use to read this, because I'm the fucker that doesn't own a Windows computer. I own a Mac and I own a Linux Steam Deck. Neither of which, well, while there are options for both, I don't want to jump through all the hoops on those. What I did is I managed to get it to work on my fucking phone. But that's enough of that. That's a rant on itself about the accessibility of Type Moon's content. But yeah, that's enough of that. We're going to do what I can do today. That will happen eventually. At least I might even do it in 2 parts just to get it out sooner rather than later. But for now, I wanted to cover this topic because, especially recently, there's been a lot of discussion on whether or not FGO events are canon, if they're alternate timeline sort of deals, if they take place at all. This didn't used to be discussion either. Previously, I think the general consensus was that most FGO events were canon, but there was kind of a wrench thrown into it recently. And most of them, the early ones, feel so inconsequential that you would never really consider that, like, they're not integral to the canon, or at least you wouldn't think. So this is going to be part 1 in an ongoing series where I just kind of work out whether or not these events are canon. I looked at all these, and later events might get a little bit more, because later events tend to be a lot bulkier in content. But for these year 1 events, they were pretty easy. For now, though, this is just covering year 1. Next, I'll do year 2, and I'll go year by year on these events, because up until recently, they were releasing enough events to go for a long time. In the future, I might consider doing multiple years, but it's going to be a short series. Eventually, I'll be caught up. So I guess let's get into it. Our first sort of event here is the original Narrowfest, actually. So it's kind of with the heavy heart I have to declare the original Narrowfest is just not canon. It simply just doesn't fit in the timeline, because in E Pluribus Unum specifically, there is a line in which Mash and the Master are elated to see Nero again, citing Septim as the last time they saw her, and the Master has to take a minute to register that Nero is a servant. That doesn't work if you've seen Nero again in a Narrowfest. That said, the original Narrowfest also had no story. It's the gameplay. It's the general event that I'm declaring non-canon, which is interesting, because when you get to Return of Narrowfest, it calls itself the second Narrowfest. We're not going to jump into whether or not that one's canon yet, but I'm just going to say right now, that still supports the fact that this isn't canon. Because even if we end up making that one canon, or declaring that one canon in my, I think it'll be year 2 video, none of the servants in the introduction to the Return to Narrowfest reference Narrowfest, like there being a previous Narrowfest. Even Nero herself wasn't like, the Narrowfest has returned. No, Nero was like, I declare Narrowfest, basically. It's not, you don't get actual references to there being a previous Narrowfest outside of the title and some of the chapter sections. So the original, there was no first Narrowfest. Even if later Narrowfests are canon, there was just no first Narrowfest. which makes it funnier in future FGO when a Glorious P takes over the Narrowfest event, because that means Narrow only had monetary control of the IP for 1 year. Good job, Caesar. Okay. Here's another fun one, because very few players probably played it. If anyone played it, it's probably the rerun. The Moon Festival event, or Does a Moon Goddess Dream of Dumplings? I think that's what it was called. That event, I have to declare, is dubiously canon here. Because, and this is interesting, because yes, I know I said I'd set out to declare which events were canon or not canon. But in Okeanos, there is a throwaway line, because this released before Okeanos, by the way, and this would, if this were canon, be the introduction to Orion. Or at least the Artemis aspect of Orion. When the Master finds Orion in Okeanos, the Master says, "What are you doing here?" Or at least that is one of the dialogue options you can take during that interaction. This can be read as a reaction to having met Artemis before in the Moon Festival. Or alternatively, it can be meant as a reaction to finding a servant like Artemis on an uninhabited island. It can go either way, but it doesn't solidify Moon Festival as a canon event, and there's no real way to declare this one as fully canon. I mean, if you love the event for some reason, then congratulations, it can fit, but it's not necessary, really. Okay. We're now approaching the first Halloween here. You know what? Let's have some fun here quickly before I go on. Because I guess this kind of fits with the previous FGO retrospective I did on all the singularities. We'll get around to that with all the remnants soon enough once I finish doing the campaign on those. But I'll go ahead and just, as I go, explain what I did for these. Moon Goddess, Moon Festival, didn't do it. Narrowfest, I turned it into a tournament arc where my players got to play against each other, and as well as, and this is not part of the FGO game, I let them fight against other theoretical or alternate history masters. Basically, it's like your fight. I basically made it into a PvP mode and made it a tournament arc. Okay, back here. So, Singing Pumpkin Castle, the first Halloween. The first Halloween is canon, but only barely. At least in the context of part 1. We don't really have anything solidifying it in part 2 quite yet, I don't think. There is something later, but the reason it's canon, and we're going to see this multiple times later, is that last pillar you get to see Bathory in her Halloween costume. And Bathory in her Halloween costume has no other introduction. It has to be introduced through the Singing Pumpkin Castle. So this is not a declaration that future Halloweens are in fact canon, because they don't have to be. But the first Halloween event had to have happened. Actually, this is going to end up being a recurring theme of year 1. Because in this specific demon pillar is going to make year 1 a whole lot less interesting than maybe some future entries in this video. For the campaign with the players, the way I approached this event was making it just an FGO event, except if you've ever played Persona 3, you're constantly going up a tower the entire game and you exit out for slice of life. I was at the start of a playthrough of Persona 3 when I designed this, so maybe that's why I kept coming back. It's also similar to Persona 5's Tartarus, I guess. But basically, the way it works is the players would make their way up the tower, pathfind, have to go back down and reset their progress every time they did it. But when they went in, they would collect currency, which they could use to either expend it in the shop, which was just an FGO shop with some fun prizes. And they could also play games that I set up in the system. And then at the top, you get the Bathory story. Really, because this is one of the earliest FGO events, I decided to replicate an FGO event and make it very grindy, very story-heavy. was also before I started designing the campaign much farther ahead, and I thought the players would be moving much faster than they did. That didn't happen. Alright. So, Gouda Gouda Honoji. The first Gouda Gouda. Once again, that Demon Pillar does a lot of legwork for these Year 1 events. Just because Nobu and Okita appear, and the big thing of Solomon is all of the servants you had to have met there. Or at least, more or less. I think there's some implication that servants you meet in the future could be here, but there's no other meeting with Nobu and Okita that could make that canon. There's not a fresh meeting, at least. So, yeah. It's as simple as that, really. Like, there's not a lot of extra trivia on this one. Once again, though, because this is a series of events, I'm going to stress this does not mean future Gouda Gouda events are canon. And more so than even Halloween, I have a sneaking suspicion there's going to be some upsets later. Just a small sneaking suspicion. Almost Weekly Santa Altar. So this is one of those major recurring events that was not canonized by the Demon Pillar. I don't believe Santa Altar appears to help you fight the Demon Pillar. But, and this is stretching it. Like, this is a fucking, like, fuck. We can all agree that the Epic of Remnant chapters are canon. They're a little bit weird, but they're canon. If we take the Epic of Remnant chapters as canon, the foundation for the play, The Three Little Jeans, includes a reference to Jeanne d'Arc Lily Santa, who's a major player in the second Christmas event. Meaning the second Christmas event has to establish Jeanne d'Arc Lily Santa. So, Christmas 2 is canon. Christmas 2 opens as a direct continuation of Christmas 1, to the point where it literally has the handoff of Santa Altar to Jeanne d'Arc Lily Santa Altar. I know I've said it 3 different ways during this video. But at the end of the day, that means that Christmas 1 is canon via a later event. So we can go ahead and congratulations, Christmas 1. You get to sit at the cool kids table. Here we go. Saber Wars. Once again, the final Demon Pillar. God, I hate that event, Demon Pillar. It makes my analysis so much less interesting. And all I can really say here is, whoop-de-doo, that doesn't mean Saber Wars 2 is canon, or any other Heroine X misadventures that happen, or Servant Universe misadventures that happen across Fate Grand Order. Just don't sit comfy on some of your favorite events from later on. I know a lot of you probably didn't play these early events. These early events, generally speaking, remain easily canon. I forgot to do some of the events here. I guess Gouda Gouda Honoji is not very interesting in the campaign. It is just fight, 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 following largely the same story as Gouda Gouda in the mobile game, just maybe a little bit abridged, because I can't justify expositing to my players that much to make a joke that won't land, because I don't have the comedic timing of the text box. Santa Altar is similar. Yeah, no, it's just the exact same. These two were not very interesting in the campaign. I just got the general gist of it out there. I didn't do much to alter these ones. Saber Wars, what I did is, once again, I kind of set it up like an FGO event where it was a bit more grindy. I created a roll table full of every saber they had fought up to at that point, and they would roll randomly on the roll table to determine how many servants they were fighting, or shadow servants they were fighting, and how many, or and who they were. And depending on how that went, they would get a currency that they could use to repair Heroine X's ship before Heroine Z appears at the end. It's Saber Wars again. I played some of these really, really minor events pretty straight, and I think even the players can tell there wasn't a lot put into it. I think even later events I put in a little bit more if there was a lot less filled in, but these, there was foundations for later that needed to be there. Okay. So, Garden of Order. This is an interesting one. Yes, once again, I could begin and end the analysis at Shiki appears in Solomon's temple at that damn final demon pillar. But the thing is, this chapter is actually relevant to Geddia's plan, and not a lot of people know that if you didn't play the original runs of the event. Let me elaborate here. This is the original event where Dantes appeared, down to the point where Prison Tower is a direct follow-up to this event. Dantes appears here and even kind of references his master, if I remember my dialogue correctly. So yeah, this one's actually a pretty home run. It's canon. It's directly plays into the main story, which doesn't necessarily mean it's canon, but obviously the demon pillar makes it easy, but it plays so well into the main story, and we know for a fact, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but yeah, this one's pretty easily canon. Speaking of getting into it in a minute, we're getting into it. So Prison Tower is the next event up. Funny, it goes one then the other. Yeah, literally every Dantes appearance, including the demon pillar, and all the Remnant appearances and his little cameos he makes throughout Lost Balls and some events. Yeah, he's pretty easily canon. Prison Tower, where he's ends up becoming and making the players his accomplice, that's canon. Which is interesting because you wouldn't know this unless you played the original run of the event, or if you look at the timing. This is where you first meet Nightingale, not E Pluribus Unum. You meet Nightingale in Prison Tower. Dantes calls Nightingale Mercedes. I don't think Nightingale was summonable at Prison Tower either. I think players had to wait till E Pluribus Unum to summon Nightingale. So it's kind of funny how it kind of previewed out a bit. Just a little bit interesting, you know? Okay, you know what? That could be a slight against it, is meeting Nightingale there. But if I remember my E Pluribus Unum dialogue right, and I hope I looked into this when I was making my notes here, I don't think you have any dialogue options that make it seem like you couldn't have met Nightingale during Prison Tower. Just that Nightingale hadn't met you, which that's just how servants work. Alright. Da Vinci and the Counterfeit Heroic Spirits. First playable Da Vinci event. Interestingly enough, I could chuck this event out as non-canon except for one specific detail. Because let me kind of get into something here. Easily, this event isn't referenced by any future events. Not really. Jalter is a character you meet in Orleans. And there's no major servant introductions here that are valuable to any future events, which we have to question the canonicity of early on. The result of that is that Jalter doesn't need this event, except this event establishes Jalter as an Avenger. Prior to this event's appearance, including Christmas 1, Jalter was established to be a ruler servant. What that means is, without this event changing her class and declaring the reason why she's an Avenger, there's no reason for this event to be canon. But she's an Avenger, and you know what? We have to take the original classes seriously as canon. So the fact that all future appearances of her are Avenger after this, yeah, this one has to be canon. Once again, I've forgotten to follow up. I'm just doing these every few, so returning to the campaign setting. Garden of Order works kind of like Garden of Order does in regular FGO, where you ascend the building, go into the different rooms, clear them out of servants, and move to a higher floor. I didn't make players do every room. What I did is I made them have to guess random rooms. If they guessed the right room, they found a key that let them move to the next floor. Rinse, repeat, intermission to go get ambushed by a giant ghost in a parking lot. Keep going upwards. Fight Dantes at top. That one I kept pretty accurate to the actual event, I think. You know, cutting out the days of grinding and the missions that you had to complete to ascend. But cutting that out, I thought it was pretty accurate. Prison Tower is, I think I might have extended it, or I played up more that they're meeting Mercedes or Nightingale. I think in campaign, and this is a little bit of a tidbit for E Pluribus Unum, I just made it canon that Nightingale and E Pluribus Unum and Nightingale and Prison Tower were the same character, just for fun. It doesn't matter, so I was like, fuck it. But yeah, otherwise it's pretty unchanged. Floor to floor. One of the players, because it's only one player got to go into this chapter. One player in Dantes and then Nightingale would together fight a boss, based off of one of the seven deadly sins. And then Counterfeit Heroic Spirits. This is another boring one where I just took the story, took the major fights, and smashed them together. I can't remember. I might have changed around some of the servant choices or added some in. I can't remember. I know Julius Caesar is involved here, and I think he was involved in the original plan. I think I even kept a gag where he was the only one that wasn't a counterfeit. He was just fucking with people. But I could be wrong on that. That might have been an addition or a change by me, but I don't know why I would make that change if it was a change. Alright, so here's a funny thing. We take for granted that, or not take for granted, every year we get a collab event on Golden Week. Some people call it the Golden Week event. That was not the case for a lot of the because these days we've been kind of despoiled out of collab events, where the last 3 years have been not really collabs. They've just been FGO events tying in with other FGO properties, like Learning with Manga, Arcade, the dancing game, or the rhythm game that was released as a tie-in to an anniversary of FGO. This shit. You see, that's the Golden Week event. But collabs, if you look at collaborations, there was Garden of Order, Excel Zero, Prisma Ilia, CCC, Apocrypha, Requiem. Those are the 6 that are... Oh, and Case Files. Those 7 are our actual, collaboration events. The first 3 of those 7 all took place within the same year. Yeah, we go all the way to Prisma Ilia before year 1 of FGO even passes. Which is interesting to me because I had no idea that that's how quickly things went. Because I started just before the original run of Prisma Ilia. I didn't think I was actually a year 1 player until I actively looked at our first year. So, just a fun little tidbit if you started like I did within that time frame. But back at it, Excel Zero. This one we have to consider, or we can consider. Okay, it is canonized by Solomon. Once again, the event pillar ruins my fun. Fuck you, whatever the event pillar's name was. I forget. I'll flash it on screen here, I'm sure, if I remember, or catch this in editing. But there's another reason this event is canon. This event is directly referenced as part of the Master's memories later on in the Lady Rhina's case files. Which we'll cover that one in a future video down the line. But this one, at my basic analysis, kinda has to be canon. Because it does actively go over a major part of the Fate Grand Order lore. In the Lady Rhina's case files. Like, it follows up off a major event. And it's a bit of a flimsy justification here, but this event is definitely canon in Arcade. So that's a little bit different. But in regular FGO, Lady Rhina's case files follows up on the pre-established story. Most of the time, in fact, 100% of the time, I consider that enough to be canon. Like, we can agree main interludes are canon. I actually think there's enough going on with Lady Rhina's case files where they should add it as a main interlude, even though, like, there's no Beast appearance. But it follows up on the main story about as much as the Ereshkigal event later on in year 2 or 3 does. Year 3, technically. So, yeah. But that one references a bunch of events, or a bunch of story chapters and a few events. But explicitly, as one of the required story chapters, is a fight against the Black Eyrie, which is the grand battle of Excel Zero. Or not Black and Diary, but it's Justice von Einsburn using the sprite of Black Grail Irisfield. Since that is the final battle of Excel Zero, we have to assume Excel Zero is canon. Alright, enough of me trying to grasp at straws for making Lady Rhina's canon. Rashomon. Strictly speaking here, there's not a lot in Rashomon alone that makes it canon. What I mean by that, because Ibaraki and Kintoki both, or not Kintoki, Ibaraki and Shuten both appear in Onigashima. And you maybe could argue that's why they're findable at the Demon Pillar. But consequently, Onigashima, even if Ibaraki and Shuten don't directly reference the events of this story, Onigashima in the story, if I remember the setup right, directly references the fact that Rashomon took place, that they'd previously done Rashomon. It might have been a throwaway line, but at the end of the day, in my books, that's enough to render Rashomon as canon, even if inconsequential. Oh boy. Okay, well, you know what? How long has it been? It's only been 2 chapters. We'll cover the next one and then we'll hop back to how I'm handling these. So, next up, Coming to the West. So, fun fact, I have not read this event. I have to include it in the campaign somewhere because it introduces Neza, but I haven't read it. That said, this introduces Neza for us, and Neza is directly referenced as coming from, or as just being around by the time of Salem. Meaning you had to have met Neza somewhere. Neza's lore justifications are pretty much all included in Coming to the West, if I'm not wrong. And you also get one other thing, and earlier on, that makes this canon. In Camelot, there's a throwaway dialogue option, or it might even be just a throwaway line by Sanzong, that you met, or you might have met a different version of her in another timeline. That is a direct reference to Coming to the West. So, despite the fact that I don't think anyone played it and liked it, or most people didn't play it and those who did didn't like it, Sanzong Coming to the West is absolutely canon. Good luck to you who are looking to read the canon events. Onigashima. Okay. So, first off, yes, the fact that Shuten, Ibaraki, and Raiko appear in Solomon again make this canon. I might have to extend this video to 1.5 and stop recording here, because, or tier 2 as well, because otherwise I feel like this is going to be very, very underwhelming if all of these are being justified by Solomon. Christ, that demon pillar. But we also know from events of Heian-kyo and Shimosa that the characters of Raiko, Ibaraki, and Shuten are all familiar to the Master. In fact, the big plot twist of of Onigashima with Raiko being secretly an Oni herself, or at least partially an Oni, that directly plays into certain story beats in Heian-kyo. So, yeah, this one has to be canon for the Master to have that level of foreknowledge. Okay, let's go back here real quickly before I move on to the last section from year 1, and then I'm probably going to cut because I think I'm going to need to include part 2 or year 2 for this to be any sort of interesting. Okay, so for the campaign, we'll start here. Excel 0. By nature, by the fact that it has a Fuyuki story map, unlike a lot of events where they don't have story maps at all, Excel 0 was basically just another story chapter in my campaign. Maybe a little bit more linear and on rails than a lot of the story chapters I do, because normally I try to give the players some level of openness. I gave them a little bit, but not a lot. The big twist of this chapter is that it's a little bit harder, because because most of this takes place within a few nights, the players don't get a lot of time to rest between these fights. You might have seen in some videos that have gone up at some point that Seki has a bad habit of dying to Gilgamesh. If you want to know where these deaths happen, one of them was here, where she took a critical Gate of Babylon to the face by Gilgamesh in the rooftop fight between Lancelot and Gilgamesh. The other major death was in Guda Guda Honoji while fighting Toyotomi Gilyoshi. Yes, I did keep that beat. And Toyotomi Gilyoshi just slapped both Seki and Saseki Kojiro in the face with an Enuma Elish. And that killed them both. Rip Realms Saseki Kojiro, by the way. I don't think they ever even revived that fucker. Alright, and then for Rashomon, actually, I'm proud of this one. So Rashomon, if you've played the event, is all a raid. It's multiple phases of a long ass raid. What I ended up doing is I kept that mostly. But when you have raids in FGO, you get that damage bonus, and they always hit way harder than you expect. And it spoils you going back into other chapters because you're not hitting that for that high of damage and killing things that quickly anymore. The way I managed to implement that into the campaign is every time they got a crit, it would double their damage. So first time they hit a critical hit, double damage. Second time they hit a critical hit, quadruple damage. Third time they hit a critical hit, 8 times damage. Rinse and repeat. I don't remember what they got up to, but by the end they could slap an NP on an enemy and deal like 100,000 damage, which meant that I jacked up the HP on these raid bosses too. I don't know if I'm ever going to do that again in the campaign, but it was fun for the one chapter, and I did replicate that feeling later on of like, Jesus Christ, I'm just not hitting as hard as I was in that fight. I wish I could do this all the time, kind of. I don't remember what the exact words they said were, but they did say something along those lines, which is how I knew it was a mission success, that I had successfully managed to replicate the pain of event bonus damage going back to normal after the event and outside the event. Sanzong coming to the west. I skipped that fucker. So here's the thing. Pre-Solomon, the only reason to run this event is to get that one throwaway line from Sanzong. If I just, snip that line and don't bother, because I already cut a lot of flavor text from this because I can't recite every piece of flavor text in FGO. But because I'm cutting a lot of flavor text anyways, I cut that flavor text, and the result was I could hold off on having to eventually read this event, because I tried reading this event originally before doing Camelot. I could not. And instead, I just kicked the event into what's going to be the Epic of Remnant adaptation for the campaign, and that's where I'll introduce them to Neza before Salem. So procrastination is how I approach this event. I'm going to try reading this event, and because I don't want to go in and rewrite it almost fully like I did with Septim. Because with Septim, I rewrote it almost from scratch. And I might do something similar for Requiem. I didn't want to do that for this, because I'm just not that familiar with the Coming to the West original story. Not as familiar as someone like Seki would be, or what the writers were. So trying to stick as close to the original event as possible, probably within my best interests, but yeah, there's no way around it. I'm going to have to do this one eventually. And then Onigashima. The players have not done this one yet. This one, I'm following pretty straightforward, actually. I don't even think I have a roll table despite it having a map. Instead, it's just... Actually, I think I do have a roll table. But they're ascending gates. It's Onigashima, the actual raid map. They're just going up the raid map, fighting bosses at each of the gates. And then they have an optional, because if you ever look at Onigashima, there's a weird pagoda off to the side. I just added like a little optional thing they could do there. I didn't add anything to do in the Oni town, but they just make their way up the map, and at the top they get to fight Raiko, as I forget what the actual Oni Raiko has in her is called. So that is the end of the Year 1 events. But I have a little bit more to cover here, because there are some Year 1 trial quests, because this is back when trial quests included a little Sordori servant introduction. I'm going to go ahead and blanket cover that the trial quests are all canon. This is actually pretty easy. All these servants share one trait. Their introductions into FGO are kind of non-existent without these. Usually when they are introduced into the proper FGO story, they're introduced as part of a larger ensemble. That way they don't have to give a proper introduction to them and emphasize it. The only one that would be dubious is Skahak, but it actively does play into the events of the main story, and it does address a certain character trait that the Master has that you don't quite pick up on until 1.5, which is interesting that they touched on it this early. It does cover the fact that the Master over the course of the Singularities sees a lot of fucking death. And it does get to them and weigh on them mentally. That is the plot of the Skahak trial quest, is fighting sort of the lingering death that follows the Master or something like that. And yeah, it's fascinating. I guess this will be a spoiler for future trial quests as well, but for the most part, they all have to be canon. I think there might be one in the future where that could be questionable, but any one of them with an actual story are pretty firmly canon. I guess if I just want to go over it real quickly, the first trial quest they ever released in FGO was the Amakusa Shiro, Astolfo, Kid Gil, sort of all three of them in one trial quest. Though, if you ever go onto the shop in FGO to try to replay this trial quest, it will be listed as only Amakusa's trial quest, because he's the 5-star there. But how I approached these three... So Kid Gil and Astolfo, for the players, were part of the starting sort of servant pool they could summon from. Meaning, I slipped them into events here and there, but I didn't place any real emphasis with them on story. I don't even require they bring Astolfo into Agartha, for a little hint there. And Kid Gil really gets no story other than this. Like, even in FGO, there's just no Kid Gil story. They're not going to see Kid Gil in a story chapter until fucking the Karen Valentines. I'm not kidding. Amakusa, on the other hand, I made his introduction in the Zalter Lily Santa event. Because that's sort of the first major story that he has after this. By the way, speaking of the events I do, just because they're non-canon doesn't mean I don't include them in the campaign. So I do try to fit everything in. My goal was to give my players as much of the FGO experience as I could. I didn't include interludes because I haven't read all of them, because even though I know some of them are pretty damn important. I might sprinkle those into future chapters as like prologues or something like that, but we'll see. The second one is Brynhildr. That one's kind of weird, but it's the only introduction you get to Brynhildr outside of Narrowfest 2. What I did is I just expanded her role in Narrowfest 2's sort of subplot, and I just made that her introduction because I didn't feel like going through the Brynhildr trial quest. At the time, I hadn't read it yet. Not really, not fully. Karna Arjuna is another fun one. This one I did read pretty recently. It is canon, in fact, but it's kind of just... you could almost consider it dubiously canon. Because I think, unlike the other trial quests, it's not implied to be your first meeting of Karna or Arjuna. In fact, there's some implication that this might even take place after you've already summoned them both. Which is funny. I don't see why this one's not canon, though, if every other trial quest is canon. Like, this is getting into the fact that trial quests just seem, as a whole, to be canon at this point. Fuck, I'm gonna have to do year 2. Which chapters are in year 2? Oh, wait, so I was wrong. Prisma Codes is... I made a goof earlier. I said Prisma Codes was year 1. It's year 2. Year 1 was just Garden of Sinners and Excel 0. My mistake. I blame Kadroth. I think it was Kadroth's video recently. I'll cut this, never mind. Because I could be wrong. That might not have been Kadroth. Alright, yeah, I'll cover this. I hesitate to say year 2 is going to be much more interesting, because the real controversy, let me tell you, is going to start on year 3. That's where things get really hard. Like I said before, year 1 to year 2 is easy. In fact, why don't I just knock it out of the way here? Instead of going from pre-written notes, let's go here, and if I need to, I will make myself a note to come back later. This is going to be a little bit less scripted, maybe. Not that I was using much of a script to begin with here. Alright, so going back in time. So our first event after Anniversary, let's see, Chaldea Summer Memory. This is an interesting one. Okay, I've settled on it. I'm going to go ahead and declare Chaldea Summer Memory as dubiously canon, because it would be one thing. There is one summer we know for a fucking fact is canon, and we will get back to that one. But Chaldea Summer Memory specifically, and this is the Skahawk welfare summer, by the way. Summer Skahawk. Chaldea Summer Memory does not have, unlike before, now we do not have the protection of the Demon Pillar coming soon. I guess we still do. Summer Skahawk, though, so you don't see Summer Skahawk as against the Demon Pillar, if my memory serves. But because of that, because we don't have that Demon Pillar, we can't lean on this specific event being canon from that. And the next summer, it doesn't reference this summer at all. No summers reference each other, to my knowledge. Well, not true. We do get a bit of a subplot revolving around Jeanne d'Arc summer, but let's we'll get to that later, eventually. Summer 1, though, doesn't have anything holding it to canon. Not one thing. In fact, thinking on it, even like if I'm looking at future events which may or may not be canon, the next time that you're in a segment of the Land of, because you're in a segment of the Land of Shadows during Summer 1, that's the plot twist. The next time you enter a segment of the Land of Shadows is during Dance Tournament in the Land of Shadows. I can't tell you right now whether or not that one's canon, partially because it's so new. But even if that one were canon, they don't reference the fact that you've been to the Land of Shadows before. They don't say you haven't been, but they don't reference that you have been. So, by that logic, Summer 1's not required. And there's no new Saint graphs here. Because explicitly across, and this is consistent across all the Summer events, the Summer Servant Saint graphs are usually modified regular versions of the Servant Saint graphs. So, someone like, and this is in Summer 1, Summer Skahawk modifies all of the Servant Saint graphs, just all of them. Changes them into their swimsuit versions so that they have a better time not overheating on the island. And that is why they're Summer form. Summer 2 doesn't bring this up as much, but it will come up again later. But because of that, that can happen at any time. And the only thing this summer really reveals is that Skahawk can do it. But that's not a point of plot that feels that tied to Summer. Meaning, any of the servants that appear here could have just been altered off screen because most of them just reappear in future events. They're just not part of the major plot, which kind of makes sense. A lot of the male summer servants get that same sort of, they're not part of the major plot, but they have alternate outfits. Some of them aren't even usable yet, like the summer knights. We don't get to use them in their summer outfits. So there is that. There's just nothing holding this event to canon. It fits pretty damn firmly into Dubious. Alright, so the next event that I'm seeing here... Actually, before I move on to the next event, one tidbit reminded me that this can't be canon. The event literally ends with them, joking that Skahawk saying that she can't undo the changes. And this is supposed to be a reference to the fact that they're permanent Saint graphs. But we kind of see later that's not true. So either Skahawk was wrong about that and they fixed it afterwards, or just as later events go, we might be able to say this is non-canon. But I'm going to declare that dubious because you could still bring in they just figured out how to fix it off screen. The next event. And this is the first event I ever played. Prisma Codes, or Prisma Causeway. This event is another one of those ones that, fuck me, was canonized by the Demon Pillar and Solomon. Fuck that Demon Pillar, by the way. Did I say that enough? Fuck you. But there's not a lot that holds this to canon. I mean, there's actually more that would tell me it's not canon later, but that Demon Pillar reigns supreme to me right now. But you ignore that Demon Pillar, this isn't one of those events that's referenced later on in Raina's case files. It's not an event you get referenced in the future. In fact, the player acts like he or she doesn't even know Ilya in Goddard Damarung. Meaning this event, you almost could declare non-canon, but the Demon Pillar just means, the player had to have had a brain fart in Goddard Damarung because you've literally seen Ilya twice at the minimum. Okay, following Prisma Codes, we jump into the return of Narrowfest. So, I already declared that Narrowfest 1 was not canon. And I alluded to the fact that Narrowfest 2 very well kind of supports this, because Narrowfest 1 has no story. It supports that there was no previous Narrowfest. None of the Narrowfests or the future Narrowfest successors, to my knowledge, are ever referenced in canon. Not one, I don't think. But unlike the first Narrowfest, at this point, this one, at the beginning, pretty much establishes it takes place after E Pluribus Unum. So, where it is in the story, yeah, it can still be canon, because it can still be the first sort of Narrowfest you get. It's dubious. That's what I gotta say. Is we're now we're seeing that a little bit more often now, where this one's now dubiously canon. Let's see. So, following up that, we have Halloween 2 with Bathory Brave. Once again, I'm pretty sure Bathory Brave appears at that damn pillar. Goddamn pillar. God, I can't wait for year 2 to be over. Or at least, I can't wait for 2016 to be over and us to be past Solomon. Bathory Brave, I believe, appears at the pillar. Let me check my sources on that. I'll cut this if I need to. Really? No, that can't be right. Interesting. I was wrong about something earlier. Bathory Caster does not appear at that demon pillar. I might have to go back to that one later. But I can still justify that one's canon, by the way. Because while Bathory Caster and Bathory Brave do not appear at the demon pillar, Cleopatra does. And quite unfortunately for Seki, who's a big fan of Cleopatra, Cleopatra has not had any major story appearances, and her introduction is in Halloween 2. Meaning, for her to appear at that demon pillar and for you to have met her prior to Solomon, Halloween 2 has to be canon. Meaning Halloween 1 has to be canon, because Halloween 2 establishes that Bathory Brave is made by putting Bathory Normal and Bathory Caster into a blender. Also, I guess I can kind of throw in here that Halloween 1 is a build-off of the events of Orleans, because she's using literally a fragment of the Orleans Grail to maintain that singularity. Readjust myself here. So, really here, Halloween 2 manages to itch it out as canon thanks to Cleopatra. I'm just going to keep that Solomon pillar open for future reference. I can't believe I thought that Bathory was at that pillar for some reason. I don't know why I didn't think that she was at that pillar. We are approaching the end of the calendar year, though not the FGO year. Next up is the Little Santa altar. This one I brought up earlier as having to be canon. I gave the justification earlier, but I'll just kind of quickly say it again. The Three Little Jeans being a thing at all in Salem means that this has to be canon. Because otherwise, Jeanne d'Arc, Altar Lily, Santa does not appear there. She's just not a thing otherwise for them to reference like that. So, yeah, we're going to go ahead and move on, but that one is canon. Even without the need for, or I guess, not necessarily without the need for the demon pillar, but it doesn't, Jeanne d'Arc really doesn't appear there, and Amakusa Shiro Tokisada does appear at the demon pillar, but you have his trial quest for that too. But yeah, it's pretty firmly canon. I'll create a diagram of this too afterwards. At least I'll tell myself I will. Maybe I'll have it up in this corner. No, because that's where I've been like, fuck you, Sabnock. That's the direction I've been looking for that. So it'll be that corner right here. That's where I'll leave the diagram, this entire thing. Our next event. Finally, we're done with the demon pillars. So they do a lot of reruns after this. They didn't do a lot of events between then and really the next major event we had after all this was Gouda Gouda 2. Gouda Gouda 2 is funny. So, strictly speaking, and this is going to make it very dangerous for future Gouda Goudas, nothing in Gouda Gouda 2 has to be canon. Because There is no more major story appearances of the Guda Guda servants within a main story chapter. Going forward, the Guda Guda stories all kind of follow their own path, their own timeline. It's a bit fucked, actually. I'm not saying they're their own alternate timeline, but they only retain continuity with each other, and then some side events they'll make a reference. But usually it's to the original Guda Guda Honoji. That said, Guda Guda 2 has 2 points in favor of it being canon. The first point that's in favor of it being canon is the fact that the plot of Guda Guda 2 involves the return of a demon pillar that escaped the Time Temple of Solomon. If that sounds like an Epic of Remnant plot, that's because it kind of is. It's just not. It's like a secret Epic of Remnant the same way CCC was, but also much, much shorter than any Epic of Remnant you're going to get. The other reason, if you're not following it ties into the main story, therefore it's canon logic, is that Summer 2 is pretty explicitly canon. I don't know if we'll get around to that in this video or not. But because Summer 2 is so explicitly canon, you see Cha-Cha and a lot of the other new Guda Guda crew pretty openly in Summer 2. So, for them to be there at all, the events of Guda Guda 2 had to take place. So Guda Guda 2 is firmly in canon. It's at this point that I'm going to go back and cover some of the campaign, because I did do these chapters in campaign. So, Summer 1. Summer 1, I ended up moving back into the Epic of Remnant. You might question my decision on that, because already the Epic of Remnant's going to have way more summers than it probably needs slapped together there. My personal justification for that was I didn't include in the plot up to throughout the first arc, I didn't include the part where all the servants are in Cult Data. The reason I didn't include that in part 1 and why I kind of try to sidestep any mention of that going forward is because I couldn't guarantee the players had summoned them. And if all the servants are already there running around, it does somewhat diminish the Solomon big reveal. Not entirely. I'm not going to die on that hill. But my thought was, why not just move it and just make that summer very eventful? Because there's nothing saying that the summers have to be their own separate thing. But I did get around to doing that recently. I adapted it pretty straight. The players get to, and they haven't played this yet because this is all the way out into the next campaign. They don't touch that yet. But they get to be on a deserted island, fuck off to the wilderness, come back with materials, and build their paradise, which will make certain parts of the island safer and unlock them side quests and bring them closer to getting off the island. Do that, leave on the boat, come back on the boat in the future, and do it again, except on a more developed island with different types of materials with newer side quests. Each of the side quests, while there are some just general easy-ass side quests, there are some more substantial ones that tie into some of the individual summer servants to give them each their own sort of moment to shine within that event. Or not moment to shine, but moment to just kind of have fun, be a specifically focused chapter. And when they complete that sort of quest, they unlock the servant. To just use whenever they want to go on excursions to build facilities. Following Summer 1, Prisma Codes. This one is still in part 1. So, you might see mention around, or you might have seen mention in a Reacts, that in the campaign, I've hidden the Prisma Ilia class cards all over the chapters as little findable collectibles for the players. They'll find them here and there, and in the future, yes, they can use them like they do in the Prisma Ilia anime to make themselves into like pseudo servants. And And I have an entire ass system planned out for how that works. I haven't had to test it yet, though, so who knows if I need to rebalance that. But the players are going to get to play around with that, and that is something they'll unlock in that chapter. Otherwise, it ends up being an adventure map, except unlike the way it goes in the original game, where you go complete submissions, go to one of the palaces, fight a world end fight raid, solo raid, and do that in order. Now the way I have it set up is they can go to any one of the 4 kingdoms that they want immediately, but the world end raid doesn't immediately unlock when they get there. Instead, they have to go and fight 3 other magical girls inspired directly by the 3 sort of major side story fights that were available in the chapter, which form the magical girl team, and then they go fight the world end fight to end that quarter of the world as a boss fight at the end. And once they've completed all 4, they get to move on to the Crystal Palace, which is its own dungeon. And I ended up combining both the part 1 and the part 2 plots. I cut out the magical gentleman subplot, because how the fuck do I incorporate that without just making the magical gentleman Team Rocket? Actually, I could have done that. But instead, what I did is I have them go to the final boss, and they fight the final boss first with Chloe. And then once they beat Chloe, the first lady, I changed sort of the backstories and how Testament and First Lady works. That way they still get to fight Testament and First Lady. What I did is I made them the same person. The First Lady's magical girl name was Testament, basically, is what I implied. That's just sort of a fun little bullshit thing I did as just get out of jail free card. Otherwise, it plays out like the first arc of Prisma Ilia's event. I have Narrowfest returns. I brought it up earlier. I just expand the Brunhilde plot. Otherwise, it's still a tournament arc. It's just bigger now, and I didn't bring this up earlier. I did incorporate the exhibition quests. They only get 1 try at it. A lot of them have restrictions on what types of servants they can use, and they have to go in and try to win. I think they played the original Narrowfest, and they only managed to beat 1 or 2 of them. Every player gets their own try, though, so there is that. If you have multiple players, you can observe one player get their ass handed to them, and then turn around and kick the boss's ass, knowing what you know. Super Ghouls and Pumpkins with Cleopatra. That event is kind of just a straight shot. There is a roll table, but instead of being a top-down adventure map, I do still follow the Super Ghouls and Ghosts adventure map sort of thing. And it plays out pretty much the same story beats, a lot of the same events. I even kept the same Lancelot gags. I'm going to be honest here. It plays out pretty similarly to the point where I kind of didn't care for the event because it was so straightforward. But that's me. I didn't care for the event in campaign. Not that I didn't care for it in the original game. The original game, I thought it was funny. Alright, but I think that catches... Alright, no. One more. Little Santa Altar. It's just like the previous Santa event. It's literally just a straight set of fights. Again, I'm going to have to embellish it for campaign because, my God, I don't want to do text-for-text reciting of the event when I get there. Alright. And then Gouda Gouda 2. Gouda Gouda 2. So I brought this up when I talked about how I did Septim. With Septim, I made it a war game where the players tactfully had to move their forces around a map and take out 2 different empires, not one new empire that Nero had to fight against for the Civil War. 2 new empires, the Holy Roman and the Byzantine. I did something similar here, except there's no real change of the story, actually. Actually, this is as faithful as I could fucking adapt it. Because this is the first time in the campaign where the players, outside of Narrowfest, where the players get to play opposition to each other. Just like the original Gouda Gouda 2, they can select sides, and they get to play a war game against the other person if they both choose different sides. They can just choose the same side and play it co-op too. Or if they choose different sides, one can side with the Shinsengumi and the other can side with the Oda Bakafu. So you get some fun. This event didn't originally have a war map, but instead I just found a map of Japan and just a geographical map of Japan and set up the war map around that. So I gave it a map even though it didn't originally have one. Okay, so now we're back to whether or not the events are canon. We're hitting May, so we're moving through year 2 a lot faster. There was a lot fewer events this year. Our next event is, I'm going to be honest, a slam dunk canon. No controversy whatsoever. It is literally a main interlude, and the main interludes are unequivocally canon. Seraphix. Seraphix, it's just canon. What can I say? The beasts all have to happen. We see it happen again in events that are future canon. It plays into the events of Epic of Remnant. It is literally included in the Epic of Remnant trailer, despite not being included amongst the Epic of Remnant chapters. No. Seraphix is canon. There's no way around that. After that, we linger with some reruns again. And actually, Seraphix will end our new events. So year 2 was interesting in that year 2 is filled with so many story chapters that I don't have to cover that many events, because when you have 4 full story chapter releases, there's not as much room for brand new events. And what room there was a lot of reruns at this time. This is how I managed to get all the welfares, is it was back-to-back reruns of previous events that had welfare servants. And even events that didn't, they reran. I think they reran Moon Goddess in there somewhere. So, yeah, I think we only had 4 or 5 events in year 2. I guess how I handled Seraphix in campaign, this is probably a better spot to end it on. Seraphix, I literally treat as a main Epic of Remnant in the campaign. But there's a few interesting mechanics, because unlike the regular Seraphix, I can't rely on the players to follow a certain path. So instead I'm having Melt step it up a little bit. If you've ever seen ReZero, there's a bit of this horror element of, oh god, I die, I reset. I kind of incorporate that in for the players, where if they die, they go back to the beginning of an individual section. So this is actually one of the few story chapters where I am not enforcing permadeath. If the players die, they just go back to the beginning. And they're left to wonder how the fuck that happened, until later Melt reveals it's her. If they break too far off the path, like they turn around and fucking murder Passion Lip or something, I'll have Meltrilus just be the one to kick their heads off while they're not looking. And they'll have to wonder, why the fuck did I just die? How the fuck did I just die? Who the fuck killed me? We'll approach it like that. I do split up the players though, and I did add some extra shit. Because I needed to find a way to justify adding in the King Protea sort of pit, the challenge fight. So what I did is I added an alternate ending depending on how you approach the challenge fight. Because one player of my choosing is going to end up stuck in that pit with King Protea. They'll have to do a little mini dungeon with Hans Christian Andersen and a servant of their choice. From there, they manage to make it to the bottom, and then they fight King Protea. If they manage to beat King Protea, they will go on to the original Seraphix ending. If they spare King Protea or they fail to kill her, I had to write an ending which justifies what happens if King Protea manages to grow beyond the scope of that pit, which FGO implies would probably make her big enough to destroy the world. Remember, we're in a digital sea. We're on Seraph. That's why she can grow that big. And the person who tells you this is somewhat of an unreliable narrator, because the one who tells you this is Hans Christian Andersen, who references that his master sealed away King Protea. If you've played Seraphix, you know that the one behind everything is not BB, it's Kiara, which lines up with Hans Christian Andersen is still Kiara's servant. So did we shoot ourselves in the foot by defeating the King Protea challenge quest canonically? That's the question I decided to whisk into an alternate ending for the campaign. The trade-off, though, is that if the player goes down to King Protea, they literally don't come back into the story until the end of the chapter. So, yeah. I probably didn't need to include this entire explanation as to how I went about Seraphix, but I could have included that in a main sort of reminiscence on the remnants. But I figured I might as well bring that up here. You know what? Fuck it. I've already been up an extra hour. Why don't I jump into the remnants and the trial quests that released then? Trial quests real quickly. 3 trial quests released during just this period and with the remnants. I know there's more events after this that take you to the end of Epic or Remnant. We'll cover those when we do a Year 3, and maybe I'll jump into the Lost Notes in their own separate video. But Year 3 things will get more interesting, so let's push this to the side here. And you know what? Let's jump into the trial quests first. I said before, trial quests are almost unequivocally canon. These stretch that a little bit. First off, unequivocally canon, the Miyamoto Musashi trial quest. It's literally referenced at the beginning of Shimosa. I am surprised that of all the trial quests that they've made free, this is not made one of them, because it is literally the point where you meet Miyamoto Musashi for the first time and she becomes a recurring character. Alright, let's ignore that. The next 2 are a little bit more dubious in the Epic of Remnant. Actually, no, one of them is Year 3. We'll push that one. The other one, though, that one's more dubious. Mysterious Heroine X Altar, who launched just before Valentine's Day, or subsequently with Valentine's Day as the Valentine's Servant. The Valentine's event for that year was a rerun, which is kind of interesting. But Mysterious Heroine X Altar's challenge quest gives you the backstory of Mysterious Heroine X Altar, except you're in a robot while it happens. All the bones in my body want to declare this one dubiously canon. But at this point, we've kind of established the trend that these are largely canon with these trial quests. Like, there's not one that has fallen out of canon or can't be canon at all. And when you think about it, there's no other spot where Mysterious Heroine X Altar as a servant, Mysterious Heroine X Altar, not as some parody in the Guda Gudaverse or something, was introduced to the player properly. Instead, this would be where the player bonds with Mysterious Heroine X Altar and brings her into Chaldea to the surprise of Mysterious Heroine X. There's no other point where that can happen. So, yeah, this one's canon. Okay, the Remnants. Just gonna go ahead and give my thoughts on the Remnants here, because fuck it. If this doesn't flow well, I'll just make it a separate video and release it the next day. But this can also be an end, because this would be a much shorter video than if I do a reminiscence on the Lost Belts part, or the Lost Belt main chapters. Just because Lost Belts have so many extra things I can cover. So, Shinjuku. The way I remember Shinjuku is complicated. On one hand, and this is sort of a thing with the Remnants, it wasn't as gut-punchy or groundbreaking as Camelot or Babylonia were to the story of FGO. At the same time, Of the more fillery chapters of FGO, this one felt much higher quality and had some level of intrigue. This is like the most 7 out of 10 you can get with FGO, in my opinion. There's my rating of it. It would be a lot less interesting if this wasn't the chapter where Sherlock Holmes joined you, or if Moriarty as Archer of Shinjuku weren't such an interesting character. Because otherwise I feel like the threats just feel like, oh, it's another servant. Oh, they're trying to make Phantom of the Opera look cool again. He's not. Oh, Shakespeare's here for some reason. And just that final climax of all the detectives was cool, but then they also drop in like a billion, not a billion. They drop in a few other servants just that show up at the final hour who weren't really a part of the plot at all, or if they were kind of dubiously there. I don't know if the climax 100% works, but it's otherwise a pretty entertaining chapter. I think it's probably the second strongest of the Remnants, if I'm getting my opinion. Of the main, the 4, not Seraphic, because Seraphic's is an event at the end of the day. Of the 4, like, official Remnants, it is probably the second strongest. Agartha, on the other hand, takes the weakest. For other people, might tie or be the second weakest. I don't hate Agartha as much as a lot of people. In fact, or I guess real quickly before I move to Agartha, Shinjuku campaign. It's a city. What I do is I gave them points of interest that they have to do, where they'll get to fight go through some of the major story beats, and they have to explore their way there. They can take the above ground routes to get to those locations, which will give them random encounters, or they'll give the below ground routes, which include harder fights, but they can also stealth around down there instead of running into random encounters up above. So there's a possibility of safety down at the bottom, but they have to play it smart. Otherwise, the story beats not really changed, and I didn't cut anything major or insert anything major. It's just that I really focused on giving them points to clear, and they had to get there. What I did add, though, is, and I can't remember, but I did base it a little bit off of, if you've ever played Spider-Man for PS4, there's Kingpin hideouts that you can go raid, where you just fight mooks to clear the hideout. I added a function like that for Shinjuku, where they have these little hideouts for the different gangs of Shinjuku that they can go and fuck with, because I emphasize more the fact that a lot of there's gangs running around run by some of the major antagonists. You know what I did do? I did make one story change there. I changed Emiya Alter's place in the story more to having originally been there to fuck with Moriarty and stop it. But he's fucking with Moriarty by basically running another gang, which makes things just as dangerous for Chaldea. By the end, he's more of an anti-hero than someone in Moriarty's employment, because it doesn't make much sense why he's working for Moriarty at the time. He's still considered a counter-guardian, just a particularly bastardish one. Okay, so Agartha. This is the one that a lot of people don't like. You might expect that I cut out things, and I did kinda. I cut out Astolfo and Eon as required servants of the chapter, because they've met them both. They're not new servants. They don't need them. Yes, it does make for some fun gags, but I don't feel like either of them were that integral to the story in any way that Fergus Lilly wasn't. I don't think we've designed him yet, but I am planning to make Fergus Lilly a designed servant. He might not be summonable still, but he's going to be playable, so that he can actually be in fights. Other than that, did we do anything else funky with this? Not really. It actually follows the story of Agartha pretty straight. I don't even think I gave them the ability to do things out of order. They just kind of get pushed along to major operations. I think I expanded what they can do during those operations well enough, and gave each operation not alternate endings, but how they approached a problem is left a lot more up to them. I'm trying to focus more on the roleplay aspect in Agartha here. But otherwise, It goes about as normal Agartha would go, actually. It follows it pretty straight. Just removes the Astolfo to Eon and maybe pulls back a little bit on some of the beats. Shimosa. I know there's a huge chunk of the community that really fucking hates Musashi because she shows up so fucking often. I'm not one of them. I really like Musashi. Musashi is like one of my favorite servants, to be honest. Shoot me in the comments, please. But I see why people get annoyed by her, and I get the criticisms of Shimosa itself. Shimosa can get a little bit wordy at times and a little bit repetitive. I still love it. It's like scratching that edgy itch. It scratches. If you remember the previous retrospective I did, I love when chapters show you all of their major villains up front, so you feel like you're ticking off the checkbox of powering over these insurmountable threats that you see early on. Oh, I love that feeling in FGO. And some of it ends up being very brutal, too. Like, that shooting scene was very uncomfortable. I also hold, too, that this is the chapter where the Master finally got a fucking character in their dialogue options in FGO, beyond just the occasional snarky gag. Like, they actually show a character arc of regret of previous deaths. You only really see this prior in the Skahawk trial quest, which I found out more recently. But otherwise, they retrofitted that into Babylonia. And, it's fascinating that you see it here first. Maybe that wasn't the case in the original JP translation, but you know what? If that was the case, if that wasn't the case in the original JP translation, this was more obvious in part 1, then Albert, you really improved. But if it wasn't the case, then you know what? Shimosa did good. I also genuinely like, at least at this point, the relationship between the Master and Musashi, because this is one of the few times where you enter a chapter not only knowing the servant, being actively, you know that servant from a previous outing, and the two play off each other pretty well, in my opinion. Just in the Master's dialogue options and Musashi's reaction to the Master. Yeah, that's about all I've really got on Shimosa as far as my thoughts with how it was handled. I think the final bosses are really fucking epic, and there's a reason people were demanding Muramasa in the game for years. There was literally a goddamn either Tumblr or Twitter or something account that was counting the days since that Muramasa wasn't in FGO. It was awesome. And when he finally appeared as an alter ego in part 2, the amount of oh shit, it's gonna be a while that I felt at that time was gut-wrenching. That was the original NPC meme here, let's be honest. While there might be other NPCs that weren't added at that time, Muramasa was the one where it's why the fuck are you not in the game yet? You are so cool. Yeah. Oh, I forgot. The one aspect that also gets me with Shimosa. The really, really campy, samurai showdown introductions to all the fights. I love those. They're so campy. They're so extra. They only appear here, and they only appear on they only appear on Limbo's demon battlefield. So I can almost imply canonically that Limbo was the one being that extra, which, you know what? Fucking awesome. But I love those. Okay. And I like the fact that Limbo is here, making it kind of a prologue to Cosmos of the Lost Bell. It introduces a lot of the events there, and I think I've even heard before this was supposed to be the final Remnant, and they switched it around for scheduling reasons. Which that would make sense if it was. But I should probably address the elephant in the room. The forced Musashi supports. Yeah, they're annoying. They're not that hard anymore. not for seasoned accounts. If you're a non-seasoned account, I can see why it was bad. It was bad for me because I had like 5 usable servants at that point. And if you don't have the right servant leveled, well, those fights get a million times harder. Because they will surprise you with just how bullshit some of those gimmicks can be. But we've had harder fights since then. And unlike the actual chapters, these chapters aren't required. And a lot of players, even though I think you should play this before you at least get far into Cosmos, you can skip it. I get why people don't care for this chapter with those fights. For me, they weren't that bad, though. Just, you might need to lean on some leyline stones, some seals, or, God forbid, some quartz to actually beat this thing. But I still love this chapter. I love this chapter. In my opinion, it's the best of the Remnants, just because it retains the Remnant sort of creativity without having, and it has a higher level of writing, in my opinion, than most of the Remnants. As far as campaign goes with this one, I haven't got around to this. This is actually the next main chapter I have to write at the time of recording this for the campaign, or that I have to design. Right now, the way I'm looking at it, and you guys might even be able to comment on this because this might go up and I might still be working on this, is it's going to be a solo chapter where only one player out of my entire party is getting dropped in. Everyone else can take control of NPC servants if they want. One player will be dropped in with no servants, and they'll have to go in with Musashi as well as the NPCs. And it's just going to be Shimosa. They're not going to get access to their summoned servants here. Because, that's kind of what happens in the story. As far as how things look from there, I'm leaning one of two ways. I have to reread Shimosa, and I kind of want to read the manga, or at least what I can find of the manga, because I know not all of it is released in English. If I read that chapter, I will be torn between either making it straightforward and linear, dragging them from one problem to the other across the map, or I might also make it more open where they can go after select amounts of the sword masters on their own, and once they defeat all the sword masters, the climax kicks in. I might do that too. I haven't decided, because that might require some rewrites, that might require some changes. I don't want to fuck with things that already work too much here. But it will be a lot less wordy than the Shimosa chapter was in FGO. I cut out a lot of flavor text, a lot of extraneous dialogue. Mostly what I keep are explanations that are actually needed. Otherwise, I just bounce off the players if they want to bounce off me. Alright, we approach the final of the Remnants before we get into the Lost Belts. Salem. Salem could have been an event. Let's be real here. They probably should have made Shimosa the final Remnant, made Seraphix a Remnant to begin with, and made Shimosa an event. Because it's the shortest. It's about the size of your average FGO event. In fact, I will probably be playing Salem on a stream where I'm doing something else. It's that damn short. It's got a gimmick that plays with servant power, just like an event. It's got time gates, which at the time, like pre-Avalon the Fae, that was an event-only thing. I guess Prologue for Lost Belts did it too, but for the most part, time gates are an event-only thing. The only thing it was missing were free quests and a shop. If it had free quests and a shop, that would have just been a 2-week event with daily chapter releases. It did not need to be a Remnant. If you play it like just an event, it's not that bad. And I don't think the writing was any better than most events. But, okay. I think some people were really hard on Salem. I enjoyed it well enough. They probably could have gone harder on the Cthulhu Mythos stuff. They really probably could. They probably could have also gone harder on some of the Salem-y stuff, the witch trial stuff. Because I think the two kind of clash with each other, which is weird. You wouldn't think it. But because things start getting too trippy, you can't go into like the more moral, like what the fuckness of the witch trials, which are already very, like, historically they might have been high doing those. But also by having the witch trials, it means that they're trying to build up suspense for the Cthulhu stuff, which always kind of gets dropped at the end, and it's kind of resolved a little bit suddenly. But what I did enjoy in this chapter is it's the first time where you get to see Mage Society kind of fuck with you in the middle of a story. Because downright, this is probably of the Remnants the most consequential to the main timeline of FGO. Outside the fact that Shimosa was a prologue itself to Lost Belts. This one, like, you have the clock tower and the United Nations really eyeing the singularity, looking at Chaldea like, what the fuck are you gonna do about this? Because unlike other singularities, this one is in the modern day, visible to people from the outside. It traps people inside. And when they send like drones in, they capture old Salem before the drones lose access. It's very WandaVision if you were to compare the two. Just a bubble. So I loved that aspect of it. And I love that as things really start going wrong towards the end, the United Nations is ready to fucking nuke you. Because if things go really badly, well, it's going to fuck with everyone. It's interesting. I have a feeling the events of Salem will come back after part 2. Like, put a pin in the events of Salem. Because Salem is the first time you really interact with the politics of Mage Society and the Clock Tower in FGO. You get that in the prologue 2 of FGO, and you get hints at it in Shinjuku. But something tells me the events of Salem and the Lost Vaults together are not going to go over well if you survive FGO. Because unlike the Time Temple, that was pretty visible to Mage Society what was going on. Hi, present day Knickknack here. So I completely forgot to discuss what I did for the campaign with Salem. So I'm just throwing it in here, and I will change back into my other outfit and travel back in time to, I think it was a month ago now, in a minute. So yeah, this actually made it up in time for Fate Week, I think. There's still time for me to mess up and lose the entire video file. But for Salem, in the campaign at Salem, I was already... It's interesting because, flashing ahead here a bit, if I go to... I'll have to edit this individual section. No! I kind of lay the groundwork for Salem early, because in the original story for FGO, you play Salem, and then when the Hokusai trial quest, which kind of references back to some of the events of Salem, is released, it comes out after Salem does. We'll get into that if I ever do is it canon for FGO Events Part 2. But the timeline of that doesn't work very well, where they put it. So I played with the timeline a lot for the campaign itself, and the end result is that our first foreigner in campaign is actually Hokusai, not Abby. And I use Hokusai as a bit of a prelude to Salem earlier in the campaign, and it also allows me to introduce foreigners for players a little bit earlier in the campaign, which makes sense if you look at some other stuff, which I will probably go into later in a future video. But for Salem, the result of that is, by the time Salem comes around, I'm treating Salem as a bit of a culmination of a mechanic that I'm going to be nurturing throughout the Epic of Remnant, which is going to be, Salem is going to have the third instance of me introducing a sanity mechanic into FGO. At least the FGO campaign. Sanity in the campaign isn't going to be like a you lose your sanity, you die. But as you lose sanity, or as your sanity goes down, the monsters get harder. They spawn more. You see different monsters appear as well. The roll table becomes less safe. And I'm probably the way I plan to do it is the first instance of sanity is the Hokusai trial quest, and that's your sanity. The second instance of sanity is more of a gag. I'll explain that one another time. This instance of sanity is the town's sanity. So the town is slowly going to get more and more insane. Unlike the other instances of sanity, or unlike the second one, because the first one is the case as well, you are required to run out of sanity by the end. You can hit the lowest point of sanity earlier on, but you will have to, or the players will have to, basically go do like the last bit of Salem at the minimum possible sanity, which leads into the climax of it because Abigail Williams. That's just kind of what I did for Salem there. It's going to be a lot more focused on the roleplay. My brother, who helps me design the campaign, has joked that we should just switch over to the Call of Cthulhu system for this one. I have considered it, but decided that would be a very bad idea to switch up the mechanics on the players and have to rework everything in the campaign for another system just for one chapter. One thing in the chapter for Salem that was in the original FGO was that they had set servants that went in with them. I'm going to be letting the players tentatively pick their servants. That said, they go into the chapter knowing that it's old-time Salem during the Salem witch trials. So if the players propose bringing someone stupid like Elizabeth Bathory dressed in her Halloween costume, Da Vinci is going to very quickly bonk them on the head with something. And if they're too stupid in their picking of servants, and they go in with zero plan, Da Vinci's going to make a plan for them, which will just become the original Salem gang. This is my olive branch to the players to say, hey, I'm sure you guys aren't that stupid, but also I don't trust you guys not to be that stupid. So yeah, back to past Knick-Knack for the outro. But yeah, that kind of rounds us out here. Yeah, there's some events between Agartha and Agartha and Salem in the prologue for year 3, but I don't want to get into those right now. So, you know what? Let's consider this the end of part 2 of a series, except with these events I also had a little fun with the canonicity. So yeah, I will see you guys next time if I can get this video edited and uploaded before Fate Week hits. Fate Week. You guys are going to be eating well.